Hi everyone. All right, so we are picking up with Levinas's Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism, and we're going to jump right into the texts now after my little introduction. But let's read Levinas's own introduction to this short article, and to sort of jog our memories. You're watching these in succession, but 24 hours has passed since the last time I recorded. So Levinas writes, this is on page 63 in the link on the syllabus. The article, referring to his own article, Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism, the article stems from the conviction that the source of the bloody barbarism of National Socialism lies not in some contingent anomaly within human reasoning, nor in some accidental ideological misunderstanding. Right? Nazism is not an accident, it's not an anomaly. Right? Its source is not accidental. This article, he goes on, expresses the conviction that this source stems. This article expresses the conviction that this source stems from the essential possibility of elemental evil into which we can be led by logic and against which Western philosophy had not sufficiently insured itself. Right? So the conviction that the source of Nazism, stems from the essential possibility of elemental evil. All right, so an essential possibility of elemental evil. We want to keep that phrase in mind, elemental evil, into which we can be led by logic. Right? A possibility, an essential possibility of evil that logic can lead us to, a possibility of logic, and against which Western philosophy had not insured itself. Right? So this possibility of elemental evil is a possibility of logic, one that Western philosophy has not protected itself against. So just a momentary reflection on this, right? We recall from Hannah Arendt the idea, Arendt's thought that to attribute Nazism to philosophy is a mistake, right? That we shouldn't believe that that Nazi ideology has its source in philosophy, or that the end of the Western tradition, Nietzsche and Marx, for example, are to blame for the rise of Nazism. Arendt thinks we have to look at material circumstances, right, to find our answer for the source of Nazism. And Levinas is giving a sort of counter argument here, saying, no, in fact, while, and Levinas won't deny the material realities that were certainly a major part in the rise of Nazism, but Levinas thinks that the ideology of Nazism, the sort of philosophy of the Nazis, is something that is made possible by Western philosophy. That Western philosophy did not insure itself against this possibility, and that sort of against Arendt, philosophy does bear some responsibility for the rise of the Nazis, and Nazi ideology springs from Western philosophy. So Levinas doesn't mean it in the way that Arendt is talking about it. He's not saying Nietzsche and Marx are responsible for ending a tradition and creating a void out of which Nazism can spring. He's saying rather the entire canon of Western philosophy has maintained this possibility of elemental evil, and as we'll see at the end of the article, has even sort of developed toward this moment where elemental evil will spring up. So he goes on, continuing on page 63, with this idea. And again, I think we can think about this in Arendt's terms. The question being, if philosophy does bear some responsibility for the ideology of Nazism, that's just to say the history of philosophy leads to it, or doesn't close the possibility of it, then we need to reevaluate what, especially over the last 150 years prior to the rise of the Nazis, philosophy had been up to. So he asks, or he says, we must ask ourselves if liberalism is all we need to achieve an authentic dignity for the human subject. Right? Is liberalism sufficient to ensure authentic dignity for the human subject in a liberal state, in a modernist framework, capitalist democracy, and all of the ideas that feed into that and ground that? Have we properly grasped what it means to be a human subject? Do we have in the ideology of liberalism the means of achieving authenticity and dignity, right? And we saw certainly with Marx and Arendt, but particularly with Marx, some of the ways that liberal, democratic, capitalist societies do not grant authentic dignity to all human subjects. Right? And I think we should also hear in the background here, as I said in the last video, echoes of Kant. Right? Again, Levinas is working against Kant, but he's also working with Kant in some sense. So he's thinking about the dignity of the human subject. Right? This is the idea of being an end in yourself, perhaps. Levinas goes on. Does the subject arrive at the human condition prior to assuming responsibility for the other man in the act of election that raises him up to his height? Okay, what the hell is he talking about? In liberalism, right, it is assumed that the human subject is autonomous. Right? And this is a word that Levinas will use many times in this essay. It's a word that should immediately bring us back to Kant. Right? The autonomous rational agent is the way we conceive of the human subject within liberal ideology, within liberal states. And so Levinas is asking, is it true that the subject arrives at the human condition prior to assuming responsibility for the other man? Now, the idea that is being implied here is that human subjectivity is not autonomous. Right? The human condition is not defined through autonomy. We don't arrive at